Carolyn and I once went to Cambodia on vacation and visited the ruins at Angkor Wat. While we were there, I saw some Buddhist monks in the sort of classic orange robes. Normally, you think of monks as the kind of people who spend all day praying and meditating and just spending their time doing spiritual stuff. But they were having fun. They were taking pictures of each other and hamming it up in front of the camera. And it reminded me that even the most spiritual person has to have a life doing unspiritual things. And so it is with us as Christians. Jesus calls us to live as people of a new kingdom, but at the same time, he calls us to live in this world, engaging this world. As we say, he calls us to be in this world, but not of this world. So as Christians, we need to have an understanding of how we are meant to relate both to the heavenly reality and the earthly one. In order to understand how this works, we can look to a probably unexpected Old Testament story to get some inspiration. It's the story of Jacob at Bethel. So read with me in Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 to 16. Jacob left Beersheba and set out for Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and the south. All peoples on the earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I promised. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. Theological commentators have long pointed out that in this story, the ramp has angels ascending and descending. And the effect of this would be to draw Isaac's gaze heavenward and then back to the earth. And I think it's true that God is doing something similar with us. He's drawing our eyes to heaven, giving us a new imagination, and then drawing our eyes back to earth so that we can see this world in a new way and engage it differently. So a heavenly vision doesn't come easily to us all the time. Our lives are full of so many distractions and so much busyness that we seem to be consumed with all the things that lie in front of us. It could be the housework that we have to do. It could be child care responsibilities. Maybe it's our professional obligations. But the angels ascending the ladder remind us that beyond the perception of our natural eyes is another dimension, a heavenly dimension, and that God is at work in that dimension. Now, God is not simply looking after us when we do spiritual things, but he is looking after us in all things. After all, Jacob is not on some sort of spiritual pilgrimage. Jacob's fleeing from his brother who wants to kill him, and Jacob is looking for a wife. Neither of these activities are his seeking greater spiritual understanding or depth of enlightenment. But God watches over Jacob's trip. God doesn't confine himself to religion. God doesn't say, well, let me tell you about right and wrong, and let me prescribe some spiritual exercises so that you can stay on the straight and narrow, and I'll leave you to the rest of it. Rather, God involves himself in every area of our life, claiming lordship over all of it. He won't stay in his lane. But what this means is that when we encounter troubles, we know that they are things that he cares about. What troubles are you facing right now? Does it make a difference to know that God cares about those things? Do you have confidence that God will lead you home? God's protection, however, doesn't mean that he's going to make everything easy and comfortable. After all, this is a story about how God is faithful to Jacob and his family, and yet, in spite of God's faithfulness, we see Jacob going through some very difficult circumstances in the years that follow. Jacob, of course, is running from his brother Esau. He's about to go and meet his uncle Laban. Now, Jacob is a trickster, and in Laban he meets his match. He is swindled into working 7 years of his life for a wife that he thought he was getting a different woman. And so he has this situation where he marries two sisters and encounters the difficulty when he favors one over the other and unleashes a tidal wave of family dysfunction. And it gets so much worse when he favors the sons of the wife that he loves more over the other wives. And this, of course, culminates in the apparent death of Joseph. And even when it's shown that Joseph hadn't actually died, but is now the prime minister of Egypt, Jacob still has to flee from his homeland and go to Egypt in order not to starve. So Jacob's life isn't easy. God is faithful to him. God accomplishes the promises that he had made, but he doesn't make it easy. Now, that's not always the news that we want to hear, but there's a silver lining here. If you are running through difficult, if things are hard, it's easy to believe that God has abandoned you. He doesn't like you very much, or he's not going to be faithful. But what we see in Jacob's story is that these difficulties that do happen are not a sign that God has abandoned, and not a sign that God cannot be faithful. Rather, we see that God is faithful in spite of these things. And so our heavenward gaze gives us a new way of understanding the reality, a new imagination invested with heavenly possibility. We might call it a heavenly imagination. When we have a heavenly imagination, we are able to look at the difficulties that we encounter and see in them possibilities of redemption. Writing to the Romans, Paul says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and have been called according to his purposes." Now, often we interpret this verse individualistically as if to say that God is promising that everything that happens to me will be good for me. And I don't think that's what he's saying. But what he surely is saying is that whenever something bad happens to me, even that thing God can take into his purposes, and that it will not thwart his plan. He will make this a part of that great redemptive story. And so a heavenly imagination can see God's redemptive purposes in difficulty. And so if you're going through difficulties right now, maybe you're being mistreated by a person who doesn't know you, understand you, or like you very much. Maybe you're experiencing medical challenges. Your body's not working the way it used to, or you've gotten sick. Maybe you have financial challenges, like you lost your job or you've encountered unexpected expenses. Or maybe you're just going through the pain of relational challenges like a strained marriage or alienation from your parents or your children. In all of these things, God is at work and God's redemptive purposes are being done. Now, God doesn't just draw Jacob's eyes towards heaven. The angels descend the ladder too, and he draws the people's eyes back to earth again. And so we mustn't content ourselves with a heavenly imagination. Rather, our heavenly imagination is meant to drive us into the world in new ways. How do we understand the world differently when heaven has infected our imagination? Well, a new understanding, new knowledge about the world, new knowledge about how God is at work changes our perception of things. The poet T.S. Eliot once said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." So it is with us. When heaven comes into view, even the life that we know so dearly, so intimately, can look so different. Our confidence in God's work in this world means that we can see what he's doing even in the difficulty. It's Joseph's understanding of God's purposes, for example, that allows him to understand God's work through what his brothers did, and it gives him the ability to forgive his brothers for what they did to him. In Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, speaking to his brothers, Joseph says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." So when heaven invades our imagination, going forward, we have an increased capacity for hope. Much of the Bible is story, because in these stories about God's faithfulness to God's people throughout all of history, we can grow in confidence about his ability, about his trustworthiness, about his character. And so when we look forward and contemplate what God is doing in this world and try to understand how he could possibly be at work and be faithful when things are difficult, what he's done in the past shapes what he is doing, our perception of what he is doing in the future. And remember, the Bible isn't just Israel's story. The Bible is the story of God and his people. And if you are a Christian, you are a member of that people, so it's your story too. Of course, a heavenly imagination is not just about giving us hope in difficulty. It's also giving us the equipment we need to engage this world differently. God promises Jacob that he will be the heir of the promise that he first gave to Abraham, that he would bless all of the nations of the earth through him and his descendants. We are spiritual descendants of Jacob, and so God is promising that we and our descendants too will be a blessing to the world. This should inspire us to reach out to the world in love in new ways. Just this last week, we did another market meal. And so we give out free meals, not just to people who are at the margins, people who desperately need food in order to continue to survive, but instead we give it out to everybody we encounter along the way as a sign of God's great abundance and his faithfulness to us. I routinely get asked questions by people. They come to the canteen where we're handing out the food and they're like, "Hey, I'm ready to buy something." We're like, "Oh, no. We give this away for free." And they're confused and say, like, "How are you doing this? Why are you doing this?" My answer is always the same. I believe that God has blessed us. And so we want to bless the community around us. When we have confidence that God is faithful, that God is generous towards us, we can then in turn be generous to the people around us. I know that God is not going to penalize me for being too generous to the people around me, and that when I am generous, God fills me up. That's not to say that every time I give $1, that God will give me more than $1 in my bank account or whatever. But it is to say that God rewards us, not always in monetary or material ways, when we are generous towards other people, and that we can trust him to be faithful so that we can be generous to other people. So let's also look at the example of Jesus. Jesus' understanding of God's work in his suffering gives him the strength to go to the cross in faith that God's redemptive purposes could be accomplished even in his great suffering. Writing to the Hebrews, the writer says this, "For the joy set before him, Jesus endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." In other words, Jesus' heavenly imagination, the joy set before him, gave him the ability to scorn the shame of the cross, to reach out in love. So heavenly imaginations allow us to do God's work in this world, to do things like forgiving our enemies, to working towards peace in situations of seemingly intractable conflict, to serve other people with limited resources when the need seems infinite, but trusting that God is working out his purposes in us. So in the drudgery of life, let's not forget to gaze heavenward, but also let's not forget to return our gaze to this earth so that we can see it in a new way with imaginations inspired by heaven. That imagination will give us the hope to endure difficulty and the love to reach out to others like Jesus, the way that Jesus did in our community. When we do both of these, we find ourselves to be God's people, empowered by heaven to live differently on earth.